Our Q&A is going to be a little bit compressed because we know that we are the ones sitting between you all and a glass of wine, but there's a couple key questions we want to get at. Ed, thank you so much for your great keynote and your encouraging words about the future of downtowns. My first question for you is going to seem a little self-interested since I'm a landlord with vacant office space, but we know it's a topic you know a lot about. When John said you were going to be our keynote speaker, it struck me that you're the guy who's been out there all these years talking about the innovation and economic value that's created when you jam a bunch of young, smart people face-to-face in a city, and here you are today talking to a city that has possibly the worst track record in the country for getting back to the office. So your slide deck was really interesting in that you showed what some of the costs are, not just to cities, but to employers and employees in terms of lost innovation and strategic decision-making and skills transfer. We have some CEOs locally who have really woken up to this and are asking people to come back to work, and they're getting some pushback. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on, if you were those CEOs, how would you message to your employees about that conundrum between sort of their individual preferences and sort of the long-term benefits to everyone of being back together?
Well, I would start by telling my story. I would start by telling, assuredly, every CEO in this room has people who mentored them, and they mentored them face to face. And they learned their skills by being around other smart people. I certainly did, right? My life, who I am, was formed by experiences that I had in my 20s in graduate school and then starting off at Harvard. And every CEO in this room has good stories about this. And the second thing is, the learning channel. The second channel is the joy channel, right? That sort of, in some sense, people who have been doing Zoom jobs for too long have forgotten that actually work can be fun. They sort of have taken on the view that, oh, this is something that I'm dialing it in, and you're just making it harder for me by making me come in. Well, the point is, actually, it's fun if we're together. It's not fun if we're all doing it on Zoom. It's just a chore if we're doing it on Zoom. And so embracing the sort of joy agenda, which can take different forms depending upon who your target audience is, that feels like a really big part of this as well. And sort of figuring out how to engage in those little expenses, whether it's alleviating parking expenses or doing more events live in the office, that actually make it clear that this is something that we care about. The third point that I will make is that your 20-somethings have a real long-term interest to being around in the office, but only if the 50-somethings are also there to mentor them, right? So the 50-somethings, I wouldn't so much be looking to inspire them, I would be creating the right incentives financially and otherwise for them to be there, because you really do need to create a sense in which it's not just the CEO, but it's all senior management who's sending the same message. Get back, we're here to mentor you, we're here to have fun with you, we're here to do something great with you.
Okay, thanks.
Ed, one of the points that you make is that the rise of remote work means companies will find it easier, far easier, to relocate, and that, quote, cities will have to work harder than they have since the 70s to hold on to their tax bases. And here in Seattle, as you heard John mention earlier, some of our local elected officials continue to advocate for raising taxes on businesses despite this vulnerable period. So my question to you is, what happens when cities treat businesses as their piggy bank? And can cities still achieve good policies and social outcomes without large increases in local taxes?
I think what happens is they decamp, right? I mean, you don't need a more stark warning sign than Ken Griffin and Citadel's relocation to Florida from Chicago, because he felt fed up with the way the Chicago government was treating him, right? This is the world that I lived through in the 1970s, right? As a kid in New York, it just seemed like every major employer was decamping and they were getting out. Everybody is mobile in this country. There are lots of other options. No one needs to, this is a beautiful city, but no one needs to live here. And there are lots of states where you don't have to pay state income taxes, and they're out there. So you've got to make sure that you're really competing for talent. Now, that doesn't mean that the genuine progressive desire to alleviate poverty, to deal with the traumas of fentanyl, to deal with homelessness, those are real things. And we have to have a city government with a heart as well as having a head. But effectively having a heart means that you actually get smarter about those things, right? You figure out how to actually do policing in a way that's effective and kind at the same time. That's not an impossible thing to do at all. You figure out how to make sure that your service delivery to those people who are neediest is done, again, effectively and at a reasonable cost. People don't mind paying taxes if they actually think they're getting value for it. And I think we really have to sort of work towards a smarter generation of city government. And I believe that it will happen here in Seattle. But we need to make sure that we're constantly innovating in government. And that only happens if the rest of us hold the government accountable. And the rest of us give them ideas, and the rest of us don't just leave it to them, that we recognize that this is a collaborative process.
Well, maybe on that note, I want to have you talk a little bit about cities and families. There's a lot of urban experts these days, Richard Florida and some others, who are saying the future of cities is now families. I think maybe because the feeling is if families and children feel safe and comfortable in a city, then that means implicitly that you sort of got everything right. Or maybe they're thinking that that's what brings middle managers, back to the city. But that's a tough thing because it takes a long time to build parks and schools and family-sized residential units. And Seattle's talked about it for a long time and frankly not done that much about it over the decades we've been talking about it. So I guess I'm wondering, what would you suggest we do in the short to medium term in a guerrilla kind of way to see if we can bring much greater numbers of families with children to live downtown?
I certainly share that aspiration, but it's a hard lift. And
Okay.
it's a hard lift for a couple of reasons, one of which is the fact that our federal government sees fit to subsidize home ownership, right? Which is, given the incredibly strong link between ownership type and structure type, right? More than 85% of single-family detached houses are owner-occupied, maybe more than 85% of multi-unit dwellings are rented, right? And so when you say that, you're going to use the tax code to massively subsidize home ownership, you're saying get out of your urban apartment and start going to a suburban home, right? That's what you're saying. That's a burden that cities have to bear against. We also massively subsidize our highways, right? It is somewhat crazy for the last 15 years that we've, instead of using gas taxes to pay for our highways, we've used general tax revenues, which means that we are just taking ordinary American taxpayers and we're just using it to encourage people to drive longer and longer distances. That's somewhat crazy from an environmental point of view, right? But it's also deeply harmful for cities because you're basically subsidizing people to leave cities. But let's face it, the biggest reason why families leave cities is because they're not happy with the school districts. And fighting to improve city schools is one of the great jobs of the 21st century. And there's no guerrilla tactic on that. That's an end game thing. And I would probably even more so be focused on lower income schooling than I would on middle class income schooling, just because that's where the need is greatest. And that's where our cities are failing greatest. And I would do things that wrap around traditional schooling, perhaps so you can do an end run through all the things that block change. Do things like experimental vocational training that comes on weekends, at nights and the summers. You could have pay for performance for programming or plumbing skills because you know whether or not the person has done it at the end. Just experiment with it. Just try doing things, right? We've got to experiment constantly in this space. But I would say the guerrilla tactic is in the space front. Let's worry more about how we're going to deliver sort of more affordable real estate in a simple and clear way, right? Let's make permitting easy for middle class housing, right? Let's figure out how to sort of make things as of right as much as possible, and that's where I would be pushing on this.
Okay, and like you said, it's not a guerrilla thing, but we need to start now.
We need to start out.
Okay.
So moving from families to kind of more general urban reactivation, you heard Mayor Harrell earlier talk about the fact that he's hard at work on a downtown activation plan, and we've got members of his administration here, and so I'm just listening. I'm wondering, can you recommend examples of urban reactivation initiatives that have shown success?
Well, so the irony, of course, is that the reactivation of cities post-COVID had very little to do with actual city governments. It had to do with the general atmosphere in the area. It had to do with the level of warmth. It had to do with things like that. So, cities like in the Sun Belt, Republican cities in the South came back very, very quickly. In many cases, they came back before they should have, right? As when they reopened the bars in Miami and in May of 2020. But it did enable them to come back more quickly, and that's obviously not our world here. But that's when we look at the differences. Those are the really big differences that are out there. There also are little things that make a difference. So Boston has a slightly easier world than Seattle because we're more invested in biotech relative to other things. In terms of tech jobs, biotech means labs. Labs means you got to show up, right? You can't just zoom into your lab space. Also being very heavily invested in universities is good because you also are being live. And so Seattle is facing sort of things that are not the fault of the mayor, but they're just really big hurdles to go over. And I think the most obvious things are the things that we've been talking about, which is let's make our streets safe, let's make them fun, let's figure out how to get permitting for pop-up stores as easy as possible, right? It is an outrage in this country that we regulate the entrepreneurship of the poor so much more strictly than we regulate the entrepreneurship of the rich, right? If you want to start your internet phenomenon in your Harvard College dorm, right, you can have 1 billion users before any regulator knows you exist, right? If you want to start a grocery store that sells milk products 5 blocks away, you need 18 permits to get started, right? And that is a deeply unfair thing. It's also a thing because, in fact, the guys who the guys who don't have fancy degrees, who are actually innovating in the real physical world, they're the people who are making city spaces exciting.
Yeah.
Right? And that's sort of reactivation of the space, that exactly the sort of deregulation of these businesses. This feels absolutely crucial to me. And, play with cheap public art, play with, get entrepreneurs on the job. I will make one final comment about the mayor and his plans, because I was incredibly impressed by what I heard. But I will just put out a warning, which is in city government, so often, right, capacity trumps policy. Meaning you have a mayor or a mayor's team who has the best ideas in the world, and they just don't have the capacity to put it through. That is, once again, meaning they don't have enough people on staff. Everyone's got 15 jobs that they're doing. They're facing crisis after crisis. That is a very good reason for private citizens, whether or not organized in the Downtown Seattle Association or in some other means, to actually provide that extra capacity for government, to actually enable government to do those things that their own limitations, the fact that they're drinking out of a fire hose, makes it impossible for them to do.
Ed, I want to ask you a question. You may have seen this in other places as well, but Seattle prides itself on being a city of neighborhoods, and that fits nicely with that 15-minute neighborhood idea that's been getting a lot of airplay recently in urban planning circles. But the problem can be that, unfortunately, downtown doesn't get prioritized in that kind of civic discourse. And I'm wondering if you would mind just riffing for a little bit about the unique role that downtowns play in their larger cities, how they're not just another ordinary neighborhood, and sort of what that means for policy around zoning and transit and investment in culture.
So I've always been a little bit worried about 15-minute neighborhoods, right? I like the idea of having, lots of things nearby. I like the idea that, we're not going to have barriers to opening new stores in individual neighborhoods. And I like the idea that you have an archipelago of places that feel different, that give people choices about where they can live. What I don't like about it is the idea of separation, the idea of breaking the city apart, right? I think the right vision of a city is that, anybody can go anywhere. Everyone's connected across the entire city, right? Everyone is not just in a little enclave where they're separated. We have too much of an awful history of segregation in this country to think that breaking ourselves up into tiny neighborhoods feels right? And when we think about where people come together, it's downtown, it's the crossroads, it's the meeting place, it's the place where an immigrant entrepreneur can serve a great piece of food to a financial professional. It's the place in which great lawyers can connect with people who are working on with their hands, doing carpentry, right? These are all wonderful things that happen in urban spaces. And the greatness of cities is the fact that they enable us to link together. They're really great. They're not just enabling people who look the same way or who do the same things to connect with each other. They're bringing together an incredible mosaic of humanity and enabling people who start with less to find their future. This is about downtowns. It's not about neighborhoods. And that's in some sense why downtowns are just so special.
Okay, thank you.
Well, great. So this is the final question for today. So your book highlights the issue of what you call the opportunity gap in cities. And that's this idea that rising income disparities and racial inequality are major impediments to achieving truly healthy and sustainable cities. And then you go on to propose some solutions, including in the areas of public education and also in around entrepreneurship that you just referenced. Any solutions that you think are particularly well suited for Seattle?
So it's, I'll just make a scene-setting thing. Cities have always been incredibly unequal places. 2,400 years ago, Plato wrote in the Republic that every city of whatever size is in reality two cities. One, a city of the rich, and the other, a city of the poor, and that they are perpetually at war with one another. and so it is, right? And cities, cities are unequal places because they are relatively fun places to be rich, and they're less terrible places to be poor. And neither of those things are bad things that cities should apologize for. But urban inequality is only tolerable if cities continue with their historic mission of turning poor children into rich adults, right? They need to be elevators. They need to be places in which poverty is not stuck in place, but that in fact you have a constant movement upward, you have a constant changing, you have a constant level of opportunity. There is abundant evidence, much of it provided by my colleague Raj Chetty, that far too many American cities are failing in this, right? And that adults who come to cities, they experience faster wage growth, right? They experience all the business about learning and so forth, but the kids who grow up in cities often are not, right? One hypothesis for whether it's true is that our urban children live much more isolated lives than our urban adults who come to downtowns to work. And so that's one potential explanation for that. What can Seattle do about it? Well, Seattle is blessed with an enormous amount of smart people, a lot of money, right? And if there's a place where you can figure out how to improve opportunity, it's here. There's a place that you can do it. But you need to have the humility to learn. You have to realize that we actually don't know what will work. And so we need to experiment. We need to experiment in ways that are smart, that generate data, right? We need to experiment in ways that work together with the public sector. But we don't know, right, what will actually make the kids of the poorest of Seattle's children into really successful adults. But we have a moral obligation to continue to fight to try to make that happen. And that requires harnessing the incredible talent that's in here, the human capital, the financial capital, and actually using that to make a change. And that is, I think, the way to fight back against the notion that we need to, engage in massive taxation of everyone and let, our core downtown areas get damaged, right? Is we need to embrace at the same time we're embracing the mission to actually make downtown vibrant, we're also embracing the mission to try and make the poorest citizens of Seattle have a brighter future.
Right. Well, on that note of opportunity, that wraps up our discussion for today. Please be sure to check out Ed Glaeser's books, Triumph of the City and Survival of the City. Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Liz.
Thanks,
Thank you
Ed.
both.
Thank you. That was great.